The sky is a permanent wall of orange. The horizon glows with the heat of an unquenchable, planet-wide wildfire, and the oxygen in the air is ticking down like a bomb. You are standing on a prehistoric Earth that has no intention of surviving the night. Fire has been a violent, constant partner to our planet's evolution for hundreds of millions of years, a primary architect dictating the rise and fall of whole lineages through a persistent cycle of combustion. We track this history through charcoal, the brittle, black carbonized remains of forests burned during epochs where oxygen levels far exceeded the 21% we rely on today. These fires forced life to mutate and integrate heat into the very survival strategies that define biology on Earth. We see the echoes of these infernos in the resilience of fern species that emerged from the ruins of extinction events, and in the metabolic pathways of life forms that thrived when the atmosphere was essentially a powder keg. If fire is the crucible that forged the modern world, we are not merely its survivors. We are its products. How did an Earth constantly consumed by these ancient flames become the cradle for modern life? And what visceral evolutionary imprints of that fiery past remain within our own biology? This is the untold story of atmospheric fire, a force whose reach spans from the earliest land plants to the spark of human intelligence. This story begins not with the blaze itself, but with the atmospheric barrier that kept the world dormant for billions of years. Fire requires a precise, unforgiving chemistry to exist. It demands not just fuel, but a specific concentration of oxygen. An invisible ceiling that held the planet in a state of suspended animation. Life was trapped on a ticking clock, waiting for the gaseous conditions to shift enough to allow for the very first ignition. This chemical transformation was the true gatekeeper of our history. It forces us to ask, what prevented the world from burning long before the first forest took root? To understand how the modern world was forged, we must look to the long, barren eons before the air itself became a fuel source. The planet spent the vast majority of its existence as a world of rock and water, physically incapable of holding a flame, yet quietly gathering the biological components that would eventually turn the atmosphere into a powder keg. For 2 billion years, our planet existed in a state of chemical containment, an oxygen-starved furnace that kept the world in a perpetual damp silence. The chemistry of the atmosphere remained locked in a narrow window, where the spark of lightning could strike the landscape without ever igniting a single leaf. The biosphere was trapped in a cycle of limited productivity, lacking the atmospheric fuel necessary to support anything beyond smoldering, microscopic char. This state of planetary dormancy relied on a simple lack of gas phase oxygen. Without a sustained concentration threshold, the Earth functioned like an engine without gasoline. Life occupied the margins, algae and cyanobacteria, patiently producing the waste product that would eventually alter the planet's thermodynamic state. Such a fundamental shift required a massive biological transformation, one that would turn the landscape from a damp, fireproof barrier into a tinderbox. But this transformation was not a sudden explosion of flame. It required the slow colonization of the land by the first pioneers of flora. As these organisms pushed upward from the shallow seas, they began a multi-million-year process of altering the very composition of the air. The question remains, at what specific moment did this new biological expansion finally reach the chemical tipping point? And what forced the first flicker of true wildfire to emerge from the silence? The shift began in the Middle Ordovician, 470 million years ago, as primitive, non-vascular plants pushed beyond the shoreline. These tiny green pioneers colonized barren rock, carving out the first terrestrial habitats. They did not do this alone, but as part of a silent biological engine, transforming carbon dioxide into the oxygen that would eventually make a fire-prone planet possible. For millions of years, this process remained below the critical threshold required for sustained combustion. The atmosphere was a volatile waiting game, slowly accumulating the 13% of oxygen necessary to eventually support the first ignition. Yet, this chemical climb was slow and uneven. Earth remained locked in a state of pre-ignition, a world where the fuel was ready, but the oxygen concentrations were still too thin to ignite a true blaze. Even as these ancient carpets of vegetation expanded, they could not cross the barrier between mere survival and active burning. The planet stood on the precipice of a radical transition, waiting for the oxygen levels to finally hit that specific narrow window. We are left searching for the precise moment the environment finally tipped, a moment that would turn from a quiet biological expansion into an era of sudden, transformative heat. Where does the rock and soil store the evidence of that first catastrophic spark? Our answer is hidden in the dark, brittle scraps of charcoalified plants, appearing in the fossil record of the late Silurian period, 420 million years ago. This is not mere soot. It is the physical remains of ancient vegetation seized by fire and frozen in the rock, providing paleoecologists with the first tangible evidence of planetary combustion. By analyzing these tiny carbonized fragments, researchers reconstruct the ancient fire-vegetation-climate relationships that operated long before complex animal life dominated the land. These charcoal deposits serve as our primary physical map for determining where and when ignition became a planetary reality. Yet, as land plants continued to spread, this fragile, localized presence of fire was merely a precursor. The true surge in atmospheric volatility was still coming, tied to an era where the planet would transform into a vast, oxygen-saturated fuel source. How would this environment react when plant life surged from the swampy margins to carpet the continents in massive, continuous forests, creating a landscape primed for something far more cataclysmic? That transformation arrived with the Carboniferous and Permian periods as forests expanded across the interior of the continents. These massive, dense woodlands created a hyper-oxygenated atmosphere, where concentrations regularly climbed above 26%. In this volatile mix, the physics of ignition changed. The air itself became a catalyst, drastically lowering the threshold for combustion and turning the planet into a persistent tinderbox. Wildfires during this era did not just occur. They dictated the tempo of the ecosystem. Data from coal-forming basins reveals an intense cyclical rhythm of incineration. Some deposits hold up to 20% charcoal by volume, indicating a landscape that burned to the ground every century or less, resetting the biological clock of entire regions. What remains is a stark geological signature of this hyper-flammable world, formed from the carbonized skeletons of ancient horsetails and ferns buried deep within the strata, where the incomplete combustion of entire ecosystems has been locked into the Earth for 300 million years. This fire cycle was so frequent it defied the recovery rate of any modern forest, a consistent pulse-like destruction that forced vegetation into a state of perpetual regrowth. The scale of these infernos points toward an even more destructive potential, one that would eventually threaten the very survival of complex life. But this frequency raises a difficult question regarding the atmosphere itself. If oxygen levels were constantly hovering at such extreme, elevated concentrations, why didn't the planet burn until every scrap of fuel was vaporized? What invisible tether kept this cycle from spiraling into total incineration? That tether is a hard chemical gate, 16% atmospheric oxygen. Below this mark, fire simply cannot sustain itself. It flickers and dies, regardless of how much fuel lies on the forest floor. But cross that threshold, and the planet shifts from a dormant landscape into a self-perpetuating engine of combustion. This isn't just about presence or absence. It is about the physics of the burn. Once oxygen saturation breaches that 16% floor, flames move faster, reach higher temperatures, and overcome the moisture barriers that would normally safeguard ancient plant life. It makes the atmosphere itself a predatory force, dictating the rise and fall of ecosystems with an invisible hand. This oxygen-driven architecture explains why specific landscapes could survive for eons in a state of stasis, only to erupt into infernos that erased millions of years of evolution in a single season. The chemistry is brutal. Higher concentrations mean the fire ignores the protection of sap or leaf density, forcing life to evolve rigid resistance or vanish. If the physical heat of the burn is what we can measure, what remains behind when the smoke clears? We need to look past the blackened landscape to the fossilized record that still holds the chemical signature of that hyper-oxygenated past. We find our answers in charcoal, the durable, carbonized remains of scorched forests that survive the flames by becoming inert, chemically stable fossils. This incomplete combustion is an act of preservation. Because charcoal resists decay, it persists in the sedimentary record for hundreds of millions of years, acting as a geological ledger of every inferno that once raged. When scientists isolate these tiny, brittle fragments, they are not just looking at dead wood. They are extracting the exact chemical evidence of the oxygen concentrations that allowed those fires to exist. By mapping the size and frequency of these charred deposits across the strata, paleoecologists can reconstruct a vivid chronology of Earth's ancient volatility. This data reveals that these were not random, isolated accidents. Instead, they appear as recurring, rhythmic pulses of destruction, synchronized with the planet's shifting atmospheric chemistry. Yet, as researchers tracked these pulses, they found something more disturbing than mere charred remnants. The evidence suggests these fire cycles were not just clearing dead growth. They were becoming a primary driver of mass ecological collapse. The charred record stops whispering of renewal and begins to scream of a world pushed to the absolute edge of biological total failure. This collapse reached its violent zenith 252 million years ago during the end Permian extinction. In this singular window of time, the planet's natural fire regime fractured. What had been a rhythmic, adaptive force shifted into a destructive, uncontrolled spree. The Great Dying claimed 96% of all ocean life and 70% of land species, an eradication of such depth that the biosphere almost failed to reset. The fossil record from this boundary shows charcoal layers of unusual density, marking the physical residue of a planet literally cooking itself. Beyond the simple loss of life, these fires obliterated the complex plant communities that had spent millions of years stabilizing the carbon cycle. The atmosphere shifted, the land became an ash-choked barrens, and the structural integrity of the Earth's most vital ecosystems simply dissolved. The core mystery remains: how could a planetary system prone to fire undergo such a sudden, lethal expansion that it pushed life to the absolute brink? To understand why the world turned into a furnace at the end of the Permian, we have to look for the spark that forced the environment to override its own survival mechanisms. The catalyst lay deep within the Siberian traps. Here, the Earth tore itself open. Massive volcanic eruptions didn't just pour lava across millions of square kilometers. They punched directly through coal-rich sediments, cooking the crust from beneath. This was not a slow release. These fissures injected trillions of tons of carbon dioxide and methane into the lower atmosphere with violent efficiency. The resulting climatic shift was brutal and immediate. Global temperatures spiked, dehydration turned once verdant forests into tinder boxes, and the landscape became primed for a continental-scale detonation. It was a catastrophic feedback loop. The initial geological heat didn't just change the weather. It reached the threshold of ignition across vast stretches of the supercontinent. As methane and sulfur clouded the sky, the chemical balance of the planet shifted toward a volatile extreme. Lightning strikes, once mere seasonal occurrences, now slammed into an atmosphere already heavy with combustible gases and dry, stressed biomass. The result was a firestorm of prehistoric proportions. What did it feel like to stand beneath that burning sky? And how did the air itself become an instrument of mass destruction? Beneath those soot-choked clouds, the world turned to a kiln. Across the Pangaean supercontinent, the atmosphere became a suffocating cocktail of volcanic ash and wildfire emissions. Oxygen levels were volatile, but the sheer volume of greenhouse gases ejected by the Siberian traps meant the planet's cooling systems simply ceased to function. In the oceans, waters stratified and acidified. On land, the vegetation dehydrated, becoming brittle tinder. This wasn't just a heat wave. It was an atmospheric collapse, severing the food web and closing the sky to sunlight. The fossil record captures this silence in charcoal-dusted sediment layers, marking the exact moment biological vitality stalled. The mechanisms of life faced their most extreme stress test. How did the delicate blueprints of existence survive such a totalizing burn? And what remained of the ecosystems that clawed their way out of the ash? Yet, before the final world-altering collision, the Cretaceous period had already cultivated its own volatile rhythm. From 145 million years ago until the threshold of the end, global geography was reshaped by persistent, high oxygen intensity. This was a sprawling terrestrial greenhouse where the architecture of the forest itself invited combustion. Coniferous and angiosperm forests surged, fueled by stable, oxygen-rich currents that kept the continental ignition potential at a fever pitch. In this environment, fire was not a stranger to the landscape. It was an expected seasonal visitor that kept the carbon cycle in a state of constant flickering agitation. Scientists analyzing sediment layers from this interval see evidence that the frequency of these regional infernos was climbing, driven by a changing climate and the sheer density of biomass. The planet was priming itself for a much sharper, more lethal transformation. One that would strip away the very conditions that allowed these Cretaceous forests to thrive. As the atmosphere grew increasingly sensitive, the stage was set for a singular, catastrophic trigger to shift fire from a biological tool of renewal into a global weapon of mass extinction. 66 million years ago, a celestial object would provide that exact devastating spark. That celestial impact, a mountain-sized rock slamming into the Yucatan Peninsula, delivered kinetic energy equivalent to billions of atomic bombs. In the split second of contact, the crust ruptured, and millions of tons of pulverized rock were vaulted into the stratosphere. The material blasted out of the crater remained molten, superheated by the sheer violence of the collision. It ascended into the vacuum of space, only to arc back toward the surface in a massive, global rain of fire. The atmosphere turned into a forge as this cooling debris re-entered, transforming the planet's entire canopy into a tinderbox within minutes. The sky became the primary weapon, radiating an intense heat that scorched the land and ignited vegetation from the Americas to the furthest reaches of the globe. This was the moment the climate and the life it supported faced an unprecedented test of thermal endurance. The primary question now is how the kinetic energy of that re-entering debris functioned as the catalyst for the global firestorm that followed. The kinetic energy of that debris functioned as a planetary ignition switch, transforming the atmosphere into a superheated oven. As the vaporized rock and molten silicate fell, they radiated intense infrared heat back toward the surface. Within hours, the thermal pulse reached levels sufficient to ignite dry vegetation across every continent simultaneously. This was not a sequence of localized blazes, but a synchronized planetary firestorm. The heat intensity was so high that it outpaced standard oxygen-driven combustion. It scorched landscapes by radiant thermal energy before a single flame had even spread to the underbrush. This thermal radiation turned the forests of the Cretaceous into tinder in seconds, triggering a global conflagration that erased the distinction between forest and wildfire. While we focus on the impact, the real ecological death blow arrived in the minutes following, as those fires began to loft their own invisible, suffocating byproduct into the stratosphere. This soot, lighter than air and darker than night, surged upward in a trillion-ton pulse, piercing the clouds and choking the stratosphere. Within days, this aerosol veil blanketed the planet, stripping away the sun's warmth and extinguishing the light that fueled the world's primary productivity. Temperatures crashed. Across the mid-latitudes, the heat of an endless summer was replaced by a brutal, unnatural winter. As the photosynthetic base of the food chain collapsed, the darkness didn't just linger. It became the new climate, a systemic poisoning of the atmosphere that lasted for months. It was a suffocating shift in the Earth's chemical composition, one that rendered the previous devastation of the impact merely the opening act. We now look toward the total mass of the atmosphere itself, a volume of CO2, methane, and carbon monoxide released by these infernos that challenges our understanding of how a hyper-oxygenated planet handles its own internal fire. What could this massive atmospheric surge actually do to the trajectory of life once the dust finally settled? This chemical overload was more than an atmospheric burden. It was the mechanism of a total biological collapse. As the KPG impact turned the sky into a furnace, the rapid death of vegetation left the planet stripped and vulnerable. The fossil record of this boundary preserves a stark demographic shift. A massive surge of fern spores appearing in the sediment, an ecological response to the sudden absence of competition. This event wiped out 3/4 of all species, including the dominant dinosaur lineages, as food chains fractured. The fire had done more than burn the landscape, it reset the evolutionary table. Now, the surviving life had to contend with an atmosphere permanently altered by the sheer tonnage of combustion byproducts. The question isn't just how they endured the heat, but how the chemistry of that smoke-choked world forced the survivors to rebuild a biosphere from the ashes of a destroyed one. The atmospheric burden of those hours defies easy calculation. As the skies ignited, the combustion released 10 trillion metric tons of carbon dioxide, 100 billion tons of methane, and 1 trillion tons of carbon monoxide into the stratosphere. This massive chemical injection serves as a definitive answer to how oxygen dictates the scale of planetary ruin. It was never merely about the ability to burn, but about the sheer volume of volatile chemistry a hyperoxygenated atmosphere could release in a single, sustained reaction. The air became a poison, compounding the global blackout and suffocating the planet's remaining biological structures from above, while heat scorched them from below. With the photosynthetic engine of Earth silenced, the survivors faced an environment defined by toxic, suffocating opacity. But if the KPG event represented an atmospheric threshold so extreme, it pushed the planet to total systemic failure. What mechanisms allowed for the sudden, rapid resurgence of life in such a depleted, blackened world? The darkness was absolute, yet it was not a finality. Life did not simply endure this global blackout. It underwent a profound physiological reorganization that would dictate the survival strategy of every terrestrial species for the next 60 million years. As the atmosphere cleared, the charred, nutrient-void landscape presented a paradox. While the planet's primary energy source had been slashed, the scorched Earth became a specialized nursery. The fire-stricken soil, now enriched by the byproduct of combustion, acted as a clean slate, stripped of its dominant forest-clinging canopy. It was a brutal thinning of the biological herd that favored organisms with a specific set of dormant advantages. The survivors were not necessarily the strongest or the most complex, but the most opportunistic, possessing genetic blueprints built for rapid colonization rather than slow, steady competition. This transition revealed itself in the fossil record as a sudden, sharp anomaly, the fern spore spike. Where forests once stood in layered complexity, the strata shifted abruptly to near monocultures of spores. Ferns possess a distinct survival strategy. They release millions of lightweight spores that travel on the wind, allowing them to carpet scorched earth far faster than seed-bearing trees. Their rhizomes, buried inches below the heat-seared soil, remained insulated from the surface firestorm, waiting for the smoke to thin. This opportunistic colonization did more than just stabilize the topsoil. It effectively rerouted the entire post-impact succession of life. By creating a dense, low-lying canopy of greenery, ferns altered the local microclimate, trapping moisture and building organic mulch on the charred remains of the Cretaceous world. This rapid renewal was not merely a passive recovery. It was the first, frantic rebuilding of the base of the food chain. Yet, these ferns were not acting alone as accidental beneficiaries. They were part of a deeper, recurring evolutionary partnership with fire that had been hardening for hundreds of millions of years. This pattern of destruction, followed by an immediate, specialized biological response, suggests that fire was never just an occasional catastrophe, but a structural rhythm defining how ecosystems reorganize themselves across deep time. These specialized survivors thrived because they carried ancestral defenses against thermal shock. Plants retreated into protected rhizomes buried deep underground or developed thick, insulating bark, while others synchronized their entire reproductive cycles to germinate only in the wake of an inferno. Fire burned through competitive overstories, stripping away dominant canopies and dumping mineral-rich ash directly into the soil. This nutrient pulse turned the charred aftermath into a fertile, sun-drenched laboratory for rapid recolonization. The planet's biomes were not merely recovering. They were being refined by a brutal, recurring selective pressure that favored organisms capable of exploiting the temporary, open niche left behind. Fire functioned as both a natural herbicide and a primary nutrient cycler, forcing entire lineages to adapt their metabolic and life history strategies to a flammable landscape. Yet, because this renewal was born of such violent destruction, leaving behind vast, scorched scars, later human observations struggled to distinguish this cycle from simple catastrophe. A profound misperception hardened in the human record that fire is fundamentally an intruder or a sign of a broken system. This interpretation ignores that modern ecosystems were built by and remain dependent upon these primordial blazes. As we track this long history of biological reliance on fire, the evidence forces us to confront how our ancestors finally shifted from living under this shadow to actively capturing it. This is not the era of mere destruction. Many ecosystems are engineered by fire. Some species have evolved to depend on it for their very vitality, locking their life cycles into the wake of a blaze. Take the lodgepole pine. Its cones remain sealed in resin, refusing to release their seeds until the intense heat of a wildfire melts the wax, clearing the canopy and fertilizing the ash-strewn soil with fresh nutrients. Without this periodic cleansing, the forest would stagnate, choked by its own debris. This is a rhythmic pulse, a brutal but essential mechanism that resets the biological clock. When entire habitats require an inferno to germinate, fire ceases to be an external enemy. It becomes a fundamental driver of biodiversity. It dictated the distribution of grasslands and the survival strategies of countless flora and fauna, ensuring that only those with fire-hardened defenses or opportunistic regrowth patterns could persist. But if nature was busy building life around this recurring danger, how did the first hominins, fragile and vulnerable to the heat, shift their stance? They had watched this violent rhythm for millions of years from the safety of the shadows. Yet, something forced them to stop running from the flame and begin reaching toward it. They began to move not away from the heat, but toward it, drawn by the stark reality of the charred landscape. This was not a sudden epiphany, but a calculated shift in survival strategy. Deep within South Africa's Wonderwork Cave, sheltered from the elements, hearths appeared that tell a different story. Dated between 7 and 8 million years ago, these sites hold the remains of fires that were not merely accidents of nature, but persistent, contained entities. Homo erectus had begun to curate the flame, keeping it alive as a tool. By finding ash and calcined bone mixed with stone tools, researchers confirmed that these ancestors were not merely victims of natural, oxygen-fed wildfires. They were curators. They dragged the heat inside. They fed the embers. This wasn't a sudden invention, but a patient, grueling process of learning to keep a predator-repelling, darkness-shattering light alive. By bringing that heat into their living space, they unlocked a new metabolism. The ability to cook food, broke down tough fibers and neutralized toxins, allowing for higher caloric intake with less digestive energy, fueling the development of larger, more complex brains. Yet, this curation was only the preliminary stage. The burning question remained. How did they transition from the passive task of keeping a captured flame flickering toward the active, deliberate ignition of their own blaze? The gap between scavenging a lightning strike and striking the spark themselves would define the next great leap in human survival. The breakthrough arrived not with a lightning strike, but with a calculated effort at the Barnham site in England. By 400,000 years ago, Neanderthals had moved beyond opportunistic gathering. Excavations there revealed a suite of forensic markers that changed the timeline of human ingenuity. Baked sediments fused by intense, localized heat, alongside flint hand axes shattered by thermal stress. Among these remnants, researchers identified fragments of iron pyrite, a mineral that holds no business in that landscape, carried from distant sources for a specific chemical purpose. To strike pyrite against flint is to coax a spark from cold rock. This was not the accidental preservation of a flame stolen from the forest. It was the intentional manufacturing of a tool. The evidence suggests that for these hominins, the fire was no longer a wild, chaotic visitor they had to feed, but a domestic instrument they had brought under their absolute command. This shift in behavior turned the environment itself into a controlled workspace. Yet, even with the technology to ignite, the physical challenges of sustaining such a blaze remained a constant, precarious negotiation with the cooling air. How did this newfound ability to force ignition alter their social structure and the very architecture of their survival? This transition turned the hearth into the heart of the home. Where early hominins were once tethered to the whims of lightning or forest fire, the intentional strike of iron pyrite against flint offered them a portable, localized sun. This technological leap did more than provide heat. It fundamentally reorganized their daily rhythm. By choosing when to light the night, they reclaimed the hours after dark from the predators that had dictated their movements for millennia. Cooking, a radical shift in consumption, unlocked dense nutrients from tubers and tough proteins, bypassing the biological limit of raw food digestion. This efficiency served as an evolutionary lever, fueling the expansion of the hominin brain. Yet, this newfound power was a double-edged blade. The same fire that catalyzed higher cognitive growth also demanded a complex, rigid structure to maintain it. A single failed spark meant a night in the cold, or worse, a retreat into the primitive vulnerability of their ancestors. This mastery of combustion initiated a quiet, internal chemical shift, one that redefined the metabolic boundaries of a species. We are forced to ask, how did these repeated, tiny chemical reactions within the flames ultimately write themselves into the very chemistry of our own survival? The secret lies in our mitochondrial blueprint, the ancient engines of our cells. Every breath of oxygen we draw is processed through a complex, energy-demanding chain, a high-octane chemistry that was hammered into existence by the relentless selective pressures of a planet frequently ablaze. When environmental oxygen levels surged and fires became a structural rhythm of the Earth, the organisms that could not efficiently metabolize that energy simply vanished. We are the survivors of that biochemical filtration. The very efficiency with which our cells process nutrients today is a legacy of an atmosphere that demanded constant, high-energy readiness to survive in a fire-prone world. This is why our metabolism could support the massive metabolic drain of a human brain. We did not invent that chemical capacity. We inherited it from ancestors who thrived in an environment that forced every living thing to maximize oxygen's potential. Our intelligence is not just a triumph of biology. It is the physiological harvest of an Earth that has been burning for hundreds of millions of years. The fire did not just clear the forest. It reorganized the blueprint of life to favor the high-efficiency powerhouses that eventually allowed for the evolution of complex, thinking minds. We do not just live on the planet that fire created. We are the biological expression of its ancient, oxygen-fueled demands. This evolutionary legacy reveals that our modern world is not the baseline of planetary stability, but a temporary window of atmospheric truce. Our current oxygen concentration, hovering at 21%, sits perfectly between the 16% threshold required for fire to ignite and the hyper-oxygenated levels that would turn every summer drought into a global extinction event. We occupy a narrow, privileged corridor where fire remains a tool for ecological renewal rather than a planetary sterilizer. Yet, beneath our feet, the geological record shows that these stable oxygen regimes are prone to violent fluctuations triggered by everything from massive continental volcanic shifts to internal carbon cycle collapses. We are currently living in a period of relative atmospheric quiet, but the geochemical signatures of the Cretaceous and Permian indicate that Earth's oxygen levels are not fixed. They are a dynamic, breathing variable. Should climate-driven shifts or volcanic cycles nudge that atmospheric composition, the fundamental chemistry of ignition itself could change, reawakening the dormant volatility that has repeatedly wiped the slate clean. Understanding the mechanics of these ancient infernos reveals that we are not just observers of a fire-prone planet, but its current inhabitants, dependent on a delicate, fleeting balance of gases that has dictated the fate of every species before us. The history of life on Earth is written in charcoal, and the next chapter is still being drafted by the very oxygen we rely on to survive. This current epoch faces a new variable, our own influence. We now act as a primary catalyst for planetary change, altering the fire regimes that allowed forests across the Carboniferous and Cretaceous to persist. When we suppress natural ignition cycles, we accumulate biomass that turns local terrain into a high-density tinderbox. This leads to blazes of unprecedented severity, mirroring the heat pulses of the deep past. Our atmospheric chemistry, once stabilized by the slow oscillation of oxygen, now shifts under the weight of carbon emissions. We are creating a feedback loop between warming and wildfire frequency that is distinct from anything in the geological record. The record buried in the Earth reveals a deeper truth about our trajectory. We occupy a window of relatively low fire activity, a brief pause in a pulse that has defined Earth for 400 million years. Current data indicates our climate is not a baseline, but a volatile state between extremes. As global temperatures rise and vegetation distributions shift, the ancient rhythms of burn and regeneration are already accelerating. We are not merely observing this history. We are actively modifying the carbon release cycles that once triggered mass ecological shifts. The charcoal evidence confirms that oxygen levels and plant life exist in a rigid feedback loop with fire, a balance that human activity now fundamentally shifts. We are pushing the planet toward higher combustion, mimicking the hyper-flammable conditions of the deep past. Studying how life endured the Great Dying or recovered from the soot-choked skies of the Chicxulub impact provides a map for resilience. The fossil record proves that survival is not about preventing change, but about adapting to the rhythm of a planet that has always breathed in smoke and exhaled ash. Our legacy is written in the very layers of soil we stand upon, where the presence of inert carbon and the absence of certain minerals confirm that we live in a world defined by its recovery from combustion. Even now, the soil microbiome reflects these ancient rhythms. Microorganisms specifically adapted to mineralize charred organic matter effectively recycle the ash of eras past into the nutrients that sustain today's biosphere. This is the architecture of resilience. Ecological strata prove that systems do not simply break under the pressure of infernos, they reorganize. By analyzing the resilience of species that persisted in the wake of the KPG blackout and the Permian collapse, we identify the specific biological blueprints for survival when the environment turns to fire. We are the first species to recognize the mechanics of this planetary forge, and in that recognition, we possess the only leverage capable of influencing the next chapter of our world. The journey from a planet consumed by primordial fire to the cradle of modern life is not a linear path of progress, but a story of constant, fiery renegotiation. The echoes of that ancient inferno remain within us, in our cells, in our history, and in our responsibility. Our future remains tethered to the same geochemical laws that have governed the Earth for 500 million years. We are not just observers of this history. We are the active managers of the oxygen and carbon cycles. And our next decisions will determine whether we remain its witnesses or become its next casualties.